Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we're telling the story of Rosemary Kennedy, a young woman born into one of the most powerful families in American history, who slowly became viewed as a problem that needed to be solved. This is not a conspiracy story, and this is not a political story. It's a story about trust, about medicine, and about family pressure, and about one irreversible decision that permanently changed a human life. Because in 1941, Rosemary Kennedy underwent a lobotomy that doctors believed would calm her emotional struggles and unpredictable behavior. The procedure worked, at least by the standards of the time. Rosemary became quieter, more manageable, and according to many accounts, the vibrant young woman her family once knew never truly returned. There's something uniquely heartbreaking about stories where people believe that they're helping. Not because the outcome becomes less tragic, but because it forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable about our human nature. Good intentions do not protect people from causing enormous harm. I'm going to say that again. This is important. Pay attention. Good intentions do not protect people from causing enormous harm. And the story of Rosemary Kennedy lives directly inside that uncomfortable space. Because this wasn't a horror story built from hatred. It was built from fear, pressure, trust in authority, and the desperate hope that medicine might somehow solve emotional suffering. Rosemary Kennedy was born in 1918 into one of the most famous and ambitious families in American history. The Kennedys projected an image of excellence, discipline, success, public composure. Everything about the family moved toward achievement and legacy. And inside a family environment like that, difference becomes emotionally magnified. By many accounts, Rosemary struggled developmentally from an early age. Some historians believe complications during birth may have contributed to cognitive difficulties later in life. She reportedly learned more slowly than her siblings, struggled academically, experienced emotional instability at times. And as she grew older, her behavior became increasingly difficult for the family to manage publicly. Pay attention to that word, manage. Because one of the unsettling themes underneath lobotomy history is how often emotional complexity became reframed as a problem requiring correction. Especially in eras obsessed with image, normalcy, and social conformity. And the Kennedy family existed under extraordinary social pressure. Constantly. Public reputation mattered enormously. Appearance mattered enormously. Control mattered enormously. That doesn't necessarily make the family monstrous. It makes them personable in a way that becomes uncomfortable to examine closely. Because families under pressure often become desperate for certainty, especially when someone they love seems increasingly unpredictable. Rosemary reportedly experienced mood swings, frustration, emotional outbursts, behavioral unpredictability. And during the early 20th century, society possessed very few healthy frameworks for understanding those struggles in a compassionate way. Mental health treatments remained very primitive. Developmental disabilities carried enormous stigma. Psychiatric institutions were feared. And families often faced social embarrassment alongside emotional exhaustion. That combination created dangerous vulnerability because once people become emotionally desperate enough, certainty starts sounding incredibly attractive, especially when it comes from doctors. It's important to remember about this point in history that medicine carried immense authority culturally. Modern science was transforming the world rapidly. Hospitals represented progress, and doctors represented expertise. And many families genuinely believed physicians possessed answers that ordinary people simply could not understand themselves. So, when doctors suggested procedures like lobotomy, some families interpreted that as hope, even if the procedure itself sounded terrifying. And honestly, the emotional tragedy of Rosemary Kennedy's story comes partly from how recognizable the family's fear actually is. Not the wealth, not the political status, the fear. The fear of watching someone struggle while feeling powerless to help them. The fear of emotional unpredictability. The fear that a loved one might never become stable. The fear that a life could spiral beyond control. Those fears remain deeply human to all of us, even now. And maybe that's what makes this story feel so emotionally devastating decades later, because it forces modern people into an impossible emotional question. You ready? At what point does trying to help someone slowly become trying to reshape them? I love this question because it gets straight to the core. One more time. At what point does trying to help someone slowly become trying to reshape them? That line becomes frighteningly blurry in the history of psychiatry, especially when emotional discomfort itself starts being viewed as pathology. Rosemary existed inside a world where discipline was prized, emotional control was expected, public image mattered intensely, deviation from normalcy carried stigma. And inside that environment, her struggles increasingly became interpreted not simply as suffering, but as disruption. Pay attention to that, because once society begins treating difficult behavior primarily as disruption, the focus can quietly shift away from how do we help this person toward how do we make this situation easier to manage. That's the terrifying philosophical territory that lobotomy entered. And maybe the saddest part is that many people involved probably believed they were acting compassionately. That's what makes the story feel so emotionally heavy. Nobody wakes up believing they're about to destroy someone that they love. People rationalize. People trust authority. People hope for improvement. People hope for relief. And in Rosemary's case, those hopes collided with one another in one of the darkest chapters in psychiatric history. Because by the late 1930s and early 1940s, lobotomy was increasingly being presented as revolutionary modern medicine. A procedure capable of calming emotional suffering and behavioral instability. Doctors described it optimistically, clinically, as though personality itself could be adjusted surgically toward wellness. What do you make of this? Doing these episodes, they make me so deeply uncomfortable. Let me know what you're thinking. Let us know in the comments below. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. But seriously, take a moment. Can you imagine being prescribed or having a family member being prescribed lobotomy? As though personality itself could be adjusted surgically for the sake of wellness. And maybe that's the chilling thing about institutional confidence. Once authority frames something as scientific progress, humans become surprisingly capable of ignoring uncertainty underneath all of it. Even uncertainty involving the human mind itself. Because nobody performing early lobotomies fully understood consciousness, personality, emotional complexity, memory, or identity. Not completely. They simply knew certain interventions sometimes made patients appear calmer afterward. They simply knew certain interventions sometimes made patients appear calmer afterward. Appear calmer. That's how you knew it was successful. And somewhere inside the medical optimism of that era, calmness became confused with healing. That idea hangs over Rosemary Kennedy's story like a shadow, because what happened to her wasn't just medical, it was existential. A young woman entered a system built on certainty, institutional authority, social pressure, and incomplete neurological understanding. And the solution offered to her family involved physically altering the organ responsible for emotion, personality, behavior, and selfhood itself. Once medicine crosses into altering identity, the ethical ground beneath everything starts becoming terrifyingly unstable. In 1941, Rosemary Kennedy was 23 years old when her family agreed to a procedure that would permanently alter the course of her life. A lobotomy. At the time, the procedure was still relatively new, controversial in some circles, promising in others, and perhaps most importantly, surrounded by an aura of medical optimism. Doctors believed they had discovered a way to reduce emotional suffering by physically altering neural connections inside the frontal lobes of the brain. The language sounded very scientific, modern, clinical. But underneath all the medical terminology, the reality remained frighteningly simple. Someone was going to intentionally damage portions of a human brain, hoping behavior would improve afterward. And nobody fully understood what parts of the person might disappear in the process. That uncertainty is what makes Rosemary Kennedy's story so haunting emotionally. Because once the procedure began, there was no precise way to control the outcome. No way to predict exactly what memories, what emotions, what abilities, or what personality traits might remain intact afterward. The surgery itself was horrifyingly primitive, even by modern standards. During early lobotomy procedures, patients were often kept conscious enough to respond verbally. Doctors monitored speech patterns and responses while cutting neural connections inside the frontal lobe. The goal was not precision in the way modern neuroscience understands it. The goal was behavioral change. That distinction matters. Pay attention, because medicine at the time still lacked a true understanding of consciousness itself. Doctors could observe outward behavior, but understanding the deeper architecture of personality, emotion, memory, and identity remained far beyond the science of that era. And yet procedures capable of permanently reshaping all of those things were still being carried out. That disconnect between confidence and understanding remains one of the most disturbing aspects of lobotomy history. According to many accounts, Rosemary's condition deteriorated severely after the procedure. Rather than becoming healthier, she reportedly lost significant functional abilities, speech difficulties, reduced mobility, emotional flattening, dependence on caregivers. The procedure that was intended to help stabilize her life instead fundamentally altered it. And maybe the saddest part of the story is how quiet everything became afterward. Rosemary largely disappeared from public view, institutionalized for much of her remaining life, removed from the public image of the Kennedy family, and emotionally, that silence feels enormous because it creates the haunting impression of a person slowly fading from the narrative around them, not dying physically, but disappearing socially. Almost like the world quietly moved on while parts of her identity remained trapped behind institutional walls. That image lingers emotionally because it touches something deep for us: the fear of becoming unreachable. The fear that a person can physically survive while essential parts of who they are disappear permanently. Anyone who has watched severe dementia unfold understands pieces of that fear instinctively. The body remains present, but recognition changes. Personality shifts, memory fragments, familiar emotional connections weaken. And the grief becomes strangely complicated because the loss feels gradual and incomplete. Not absence, transformation. And that's part of what makes Rosemary Kennedy's story feel so emotionally devastating. The procedure didn't simply fail medically. It altered the continuity of a human life. And unlike many tragedies, this one emerged from people believing they were making the correct decision. That's what keeps the story from becoming simplistic. The family likely believed they were pursuing hope. The doctors likely believed they were practicing cutting-edge medicine. The institution likely believed it was offering treatment. And yet the result became one of the most haunting examples in modern psychiatric history of what can happen when certainty outruns understanding. Especially when the thing being altered is the human mind itself. There's also something deeply unsettling about how the procedure worked, according to the standards of the time. Rosemary reportedly became calmer afterward, quieter, more manageable. There's the word again, manageable. But that creates a terrifying ethical question. If emotional intensity disappears because portions of personality disappear alongside it, was the suffering truly healed? Or was the person simply reduced? That question sits at the center of nearly all existential fears surrounding lobotomy, because the procedure forces people to confront something deeply uncomfortable. A calmer person is not automatically a healthier person, and a quiet person is not automatically a happier person. And reducing visible stress does not necessarily restore the fullness of human life.